There's a simple idea, one so small, so obvious, that once you see it, you can't unsee it. It explains why gods appeared in every culture, why people sacrificed animals, built temples, feared the sky, worshipped rivers, and invented rules they believed came from the heavens. And here's the twist. It has nothing to do with truth, and everything to do with survival. Because the invention of God wasn't a spiritual event, it was a psychological one. And once you understand this idea, you'll understand every religion on earth, past and present. You'll understand why people cling to belief, why they fear doubt, and why letting go feels like betrayal. So, let's start with the one idea that reveals the entire mechanism: the first fear. Imagine being the first human who truly understood death, not as a metaphor or a distant idea, but as a final, physical ending. You watch someone collapse. Their breathing stops, their eyes lose their light, and you suddenly realize that the same thing will eventually happen to you. Your body will decay, your thoughts will vanish. Everything you love will disappear along with you. For any creature with imagination, that realization is unbearable. Humans don't just live in the moment like other animals. We remember the past and picture the future. And once you can imagine the future, you can imagine the end. That's the moment fear enters the human story. Not a small fear, but a deep, existential terror that sits in the center of your chest and never leaves. A fear that keeps you awake at night. A fear that demands relief. So what do humans do with a fear too big to carry? We create meaning. We create stories. We create explanations that turn chaos into something guided. We imagine that death isn't an ending but a doorway. That the people we lose still exist somewhere else. That unseen beings watch over us, protect us, judge us, reward us. Suddenly, the randomness of life feels intentional. The cruelty of nature feels controlled. The idea of disappearing forever feels less painful. God wasn't invented because early humans were foolish. God was invented because they were overwhelmed. They needed a way to live with the knowledge of death, a way to feel safe in a world full of danger, a way to believe that their suffering mattered and that their existence wasn't just an accident. This is where the idea begins, a psychological shield, a story strong enough to quiet the first fear. But that fear was only the beginning of something far bigger, because once death became meaningful, power did too. The gap problem. Every early civilization lived inside a world filled with mysteries they had no tools to understand. Lightning split the sky without warning. Diseases swept through entire villages. Earthquakes shook the ground as if something alive was moving beneath it. People dreamed strange, vivid scenes at night and woke up wondering where those images came from. And sometimes, the sun itself vanished behind the moon, turning day into sudden darkness. For a mind without science, these moments were overwhelming. The gaps in knowledge weren't small, they were vast, terrifying chasms. And humans, by nature, cannot tolerate a gap for long. When we don't know something, we guess. When we guess, we create stories. And when we create stories, we tend to choose explanations that soothe us, not ones that confuse us further. A simple, "I don't know," eventually became, "Someone must be doing this." If thunder shakes the sky, maybe it's the anger of a god. If crops die in the heat, maybe it's punishment for something the tribe did. If a child becomes ill, perhaps it's a curse or a sin or an unseen force testing the family. These stories didn't appear because people were irrational. They appeared because intention is comforting. Purpose is comforting. A storm without meaning is frightening. A storm caused by a god, even an angry one, at least feels understandable. The moment humans assign intention to nature, they cross a psychological line. Lightning is no longer electricity, it becomes communication. Illness is no longer biology, it becomes judgment. A flood is no longer weather, it becomes a message. And once nature is seen as intentional, the idea of gods becomes inevitable. But this next part is where everything really locks into place. Because once people believed nature had intentions, someone eventually claimed to know exactly what those intentions were. The authority trick. A story on its own is powerful, but a story backed by authority becomes something entirely different. In every early society, there came a moment when someone stepped forward and said the words that changed everything. "The gods spoke to me." With that single claim, they gained a kind of influence no warrior, no hunter, no elder could ever match. Because if a rule comes from another human, you can argue with it, negotiate it, or simply refuse. But if a rule comes from the sky, from a being who controls storms or famine or death itself, then you obey, you fear, you stop asking questions. This was the moment religion transformed from explanation into structure. What started as stories to soothe fear became systems that shaped behavior. Religion became the first political system, deciding who held power. It became the first legal system, prescribing which actions were punishable. It became the first social control system, telling people how to live, what to eat, who to marry, and how to think. Every command that once required persuasion could now be justified with a single sentence: "This is what the gods want." Divine authority is the strongest authority humans have ever invented because it bypasses logic and binds directly to fear, loyalty, and identity. If a leader speaks for a god, disagreeing with that leader becomes more than rebellion. It becomes blasphemy. And blasphemy isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. People don't risk eternal punishment. They don't challenge the voice of the heavens. Once someone claims divine authority, the structure becomes almost impossible to break. The story becomes sacred. The leader becomes untouchable. The rules become eternal. But here's the strange part. The more unquestionable the authority became, the more people stopped noticing that it wasn't the gods speaking at all. It was the humans behind them. The comfort contract. Religion didn't spread because people verified it, or proved it, or tested its claims. It spread because it felt good. It made the world softer. It made suffering feel less random and less cruel. When life was harsh and unpredictable, religion stepped in with answers to the questions that haunted every human mind. Why do bad things happen? Why am I suffering? What is my purpose? What happens after I die? These questions don't just demand explanations, they demand comfort, and religion offered exactly that. It told people their pain wasn't meaningless. It told them their struggles were part of a bigger story. It told them their loved ones weren't gone forever, and that their lives had cosmic significance. It took the sharp edges of existence and wrapped them in hope, and that hope felt like a warm blanket in a cold world. But religion didn't just offer emotional relief. It offered identity, giving people a place in the universe. It offered community, giving them belonging. It offered a sense of order when life constantly seemed out of control. For many, it became emotional anesthesia, numbing fears they couldn't cope with on their own. People didn't consciously sign paperwork or shake hands with priests. But over time, a silent agreement formed, a psychological contract that shaped entire civilizations. You give me comfort, I give you obedience. People gave up autonomy in exchange for reassurance. They followed rituals and rules because those rituals promised protection. They accepted doctrines because those doctrines promised meaning. And they did it willingly, because the alternative was unbearable: a universe without guidance, without purpose, without guarantees. But comfort, especially spiritual comfort, always comes with a price. And the price was not paid in money, but in something far more valuable: the ability to question, to doubt, to think freely. Because once a system becomes the source of your comfort, you'll defend it, even against your own reason. The fear hack. Once a system becomes the source of comfort, it also becomes fragile. If it can be questioned, it can be doubted. And if it can be doubted, it can be abandoned. So, early religious structures discovered something powerful and incredibly effective. Comfort alone is never enough to hold a community together. To survive, a belief must be protected. And the strongest form of protection is fear. Fear shapes behavior faster than hope ever can. That is why almost every religion introduces concepts designed to keep people in line. Hell becomes the ultimate threat, a place of eternal punishment described in vivid detail. Curses become reminders that the unseen world can harm you at any moment. Sin becomes a label that turns ordinary human impulses into dangers for your soul. Sacred rules become untouchable boundaries that no one is allowed to cross. And holy texts become objects that cannot be questioned, interpreted, or challenged without risking spiritual consequences. Fear freezes the mind. It stops people from exploring ideas that might dismantle the system. It turns doubt into danger and curiosity into a trap. When fear is present, Even intelligent people hesitate before asking a simple question: what if this was all invented by humans? This is the core psychological mechanism behind the survival of religious belief. A conviction built on fear defends itself even without evidence. People do not need proof when the alternative feels terrifying. The fear of punishment, the fear of isolation, the fear of divine judgment, and the fear of meaninglessness all work together to keep the system intact. Comfort draws people in, but fear locks the door behind them. And once fear becomes part of the structure, belief no longer needs to persuade, it only needs to warn. But the story does not end here, because something even more powerful than fear was waiting to shape the next chapter of human belief: the community cage. Humans are tribal by nature. We survive by belonging to groups, and we suffer deeply when those groups turn against us. In fact, psychological studies show that social rejection activates the same areas of the brain as physical pain. Our ancestors understood this instinct long before science ever proved it, and religions understood it even earlier. The moment belief systems began to form, they did something incredibly effective. They wove identity and faith together so tightly that separating them became almost impossible. You were not just a person who believed in certain gods. You were part of a community defined by those gods. Your rituals, your celebrations, your morals, your family roles, your worldview, even your daily habits, all became intertwined with the belief system around you. So if you ever began to doubt the gods, you were not simply questioning an idea. You were threatening the entire social fabric. You were not just wrong, you were dangerous. You were a heretic, a traitor, someone who risked the safety and unity of the group. Very quickly, belief stopped being about truth and started being about survival. The community became a cage with golden bars. You stayed inside not because you were convinced, but because the cost of leaving was unbearable. To question the religion of your tribe meant losing your family, your friends, your social status, your protection, and sometimes even your life. For many people, it was easier to silence their doubts than to face the emotional exile that would follow. This is why religious systems endure even when their claims collapse under scrutiny. The fear of loneliness is stronger than the desire for truth. When belonging requires belief, even the skeptical will pretend. And that pressure created one final ingredient that explains why the idea of God became nearly unbreakable: the meaning engine. Humans cannot function without meaning. We are not built to simply exist, eat, sleep, and survive. We need a story to place ourselves in. We need a sense of purpose that connects our actions to something larger than the daily routine. We need to believe that our lives matter in a way that goes beyond biology. This need is not a flaw, it is a feature of human consciousness. Once we became creatures capable of imagining the future, we also became creatures capable of imagining why the future should matter at all. Religion stepped into that psychological space perfectly. It told people that their lives had cosmic significance. It told them that their choices were part of a divine plan. It gave them roles in a story that stretched across eternity. The farmer was not just a farmer. The mother was not just a mother. The elder was not just an aging human. They were all characters in a universe where their existence was noticed, guided, and valued by supernatural forces. Religion gave people destiny when the world itself felt directionless. It also answered a question that science still struggles to approach. Why am I here? Not how life developed, not what atoms do, not how stars form. The deeper question is about significance, not mechanics. Religion offered simple, powerful answers long before humans understood their own psychology. You are here because you were created for a reason. You matter because you belong to something greater. You are part of a design. But here is the part that changes everything. Meaning can be manufactured. It can be created from stories, symbols, and rituals. It can be shaped by culture and repetition. And once you understand that meaning does not require divine origin, you begin to see the illusion behind the curtain. You begin to see that humans were not discovering cosmic purpose. We were building it ourselves, piece by piece, and calling it sacred. The evolution of belief. Here is the simple idea that changes everything about how we view religion. God was not discovered like a hidden treasure waiting beneath the surface of the world. God was created. Created as a tool, a psychological survival mechanism designed to help early humans navigate fear, uncertainty, and the overwhelming complexity of existence. But that idea did not stay frozen in time. It evolved as we evolved. When humans developed language, we gained the ability to pass stories across generations. When we developed imagination, we could picture beings we never saw. When we created rituals, we built consistent practices that reinforced belief. When we formed hierarchies, we created leaders who could claim direct access to the divine. As each layer of human development formed, the concept of God transformed along with it. This is why every culture invented its own version of a god. Not because one divine truth was being discovered again and again, but because each society faced different fears and gaps in understanding. Some feared the ocean, so their gods ruled the waves. Some depended on the sun, so their gods were made of fire and light. Some struggled with harsh winters, so their gods controlled the seasons. The gods reflected each culture's needs, anxieties, hopes, and worldview. The details changed, but the psychological purpose remained identical. The differences between religions are cosmetic. The mechanism underneath is the same. A human mind encountering a frightening world constructs stories that provide order, comfort, and authority. Once you recognize this pattern, something remarkable happens. Every religion becomes transparent. The supernatural elements start to look like symbolic storytelling. The rituals start to resemble cultural habits. The doctrines start to feel like inherited psychology rather than divine revelation. And once the pattern becomes clear, it leads to an unavoidable final question, the question that reveals what happens when the illusion cracks open and you finally see where these ideas truly came from. What happens after the illusion breaks? When you finally understand that God was invented, the world does not collapse. It does not become cold or empty or meaningless. In fact, the opposite happens. The world becomes clearer. The noise quiets. The shadows shrink. Life becomes more honest because you are no longer looking at reality through the lens of fear or inherited stories. You begin to see people as they are, not as characters in a divine script. You begin to see yourself as a human being navigating a brief, precious moment in time rather than a soul trapped between heaven and hell. Morality changes too. It no longer comes from fear of punishment or desire for reward. It comes from understanding, empathy, and the simple recognition that other people feel pain and joy just as deeply as you do. Goodness becomes something genuine rather than something performed. You help others not to please a deity, but because compassion feels natural. Justice becomes something grounded in reason rather than doctrine. Meaning also shifts. It no longer comes from a book or a priest or a story written thousands of years ago. It comes from the life you choose to create. It comes from the relationships you build, the passions you pursue, and the values you decide to live by. You stop waiting for a cosmic assignment and start crafting your own direction with deliberate intention. Purpose becomes something internal rather than something granted from above. You realize that you are the author, not the actor. You are the one who shapes the narrative of your existence. And the universe, once terrifying in its silence, becomes far more beautiful. It becomes a place not designed for you, yet completely open to you. A place full of wonder, randomness, possibility, and moments that matter precisely because they are fleeting. When the illusion breaks, life does not shrink. It expands. It becomes real. It becomes yours. So what does all of this really mean? It means humans did not invent God out of ignorance or foolishness. We invented God because we were brilliant. We were creative enough to soften the weight of our fears. We were organized enough to build entire systems around shared stories. We were imaginative enough to turn simple explanations into vast civilizations that lasted for centuries. God was not a discovery. God was a tool. God was a mirror that reflected our hopes and our anxieties. God was a story that helped us survive long before we understood the world we were living in. But stories evolve, and so do we. The real power was never in the sky. It was always in the human mind. It was in our ability to question and to learn. It was in our courage to grow beyond the narratives we inherited. The moment you recognize that power, the world changes. It becomes less about obedience and more about clarity, less about fear and more about freedom. If this video challenged what you were taught or opened a new way of seeing your own beliefs, then stay with us. Subscribe, not for dogma, but for understanding. Not for certainty, but for curiosity. Keep questioning. That is where truth begins.